The hat was the last thing she expected to laugh at, and the moment she did, everything changed. It happened in the middle of the busiest street in Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday afternoon in the fall of 1882, when the wind came howling down from the north with the first cold edge of the season riding its breath. Sylvie Zane stood outside the general store with a bolt of blue calico tucked under one arm and a look on her face that could have stopped a stampede. She had been in town exactly 4 days, which was long enough to know that Caldwell was the kind of place that chewed people up and asked no questions afterward. She had not yet decided whether she was going to stay. The man who changed that came walking out of the Marshal's office across the street wearing the most battered, sun-bleached, shapeless ruin of a hat she had ever seen on a human head. It had once, perhaps in another lifetime, been a proper black Stetson. Now it sagged on one side, its crown crushed into a lopsided dome, the brim curled up at the front like it was trying to look at the sky and had given up halfway. There was a hole near the left side, and the hatband was nothing more than a strip of rawhide twisted around itself. The man wearing it was the Marshal of Caldwell. His name, she would learn, was Langley. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, and he walked like the ground belonged to him, each step deliberate and unhurried. His face was angular and serious, with a jaw that looked carved from the same limestone as the bluffs along the Cimarron River. He had a tin star pinned to his vest and a Colt single-action army on his hip, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had survived things that would have unmade lesser people, and she laughed. It came out before she could stop it, not a polite little sound but a real one, genuine and startled, the kind of laugh that forces its way up from somewhere honest. She pressed her hand over her mouth immediately, but the sound was already out in the world and the Marshal had already heard it. He stopped in the middle of the street. His dark eyes found her across the distance between them. He looked at her for a moment, then looked up at his hat, then back at her. The expression on his face was not anger exactly, though it had anger in it somewhere around the edges. It was something more complicated than that. It was the look of a man who had just been caught being human in public. He walked across the street toward her, and Sylvie stood her ground because she had not survived 23 years in a world that kept trying to knock her down by running from things that walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "Something amusing," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard. She glanced at the hat again and pressed her lips together, fighting the smile. "I am sorry," she said. "I truly am. It is only that I have never seen a hat quite so." She searched for a kind word and failed to find one, distinguished. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, not quite offense. "It is a good hat," he said. "Marshal," she said, because she had already been told who he was by Mrs. Adler at the boarding house. "That hat has seen better days, better years, possibly a better decade." And that was when he said it, quiet as a stone dropped into still water, the words falling between them with a weight that neither of them was prepared for. "I will buy a new one," he said, "if you stay." The silence that followed was enormous. Sylvie Zane stared at him. Langley stared back. Neither of them moved. She had arrived in Caldwell 4 days ago with $42 in her pocketbook, a trunk of belongings, a dark past she was running from, and absolutely no plan that extended beyond the next week. She had not come here looking for anything except distance from what she had left behind. She had not come here looking for a man who would offer to change himself for a woman he had known for 30 seconds. She did not know, standing there in the October wind with the calico bolt under her arm and laughter still warm in her chest, that she was looking at the man who was going to ruin her for every version of her life that did not include him. She did not know it yet, but she was about to find out. 3 weeks before that moment on the main street of Caldwell, Sylvie Zane had been standing in the kitchen of a farmhouse outside of Wichita, listening to the sound of her future collapse around her ears. The farm had belonged to her father, Walter Zane, who had died of fever 2 years prior, leaving the land and everything on it to Sylvie and her older brother, Clement. The arrangement had been fine in theory. In practice, Clement was reckless with money in the way that some men are reckless with whiskey, compulsively and without apology. And by the time Sylvie understood the depth of the problem, the debt was already larger than the land was worth. She had spent the 2 years since her father's death keeping the farm running, managing the accounts, trying to hold together what her brother kept pulling apart at the seams. She had done it without complaint, without help, and without gratitude from Clement, who seemed to regard her competence as a personal insult. She was 23 years old, and she felt 45. The collapse came on a Wednesday in September. The man from the bank arrived in a buggy at 8 in the morning, formal and apologetic in the practiced way of people who deliver bad news professionally. The debt had been called in. The farm was to be sold. They had 30 days. Clement, predictably, was nowhere to be found. Sylvie sat at the kitchen table after the bank man left and looked at the room her mother had cooked in for 20 years, and felt something harden inside her that had previously been soft. She was done waiting for circumstances to improve. She was done managing a situation that could not be managed. She was going to go somewhere new and start something of her own, and she was going to do it without Clement, without the farm, without anything that tethered her to a life that had never quite fit. She packed a trunk, took the money from the household account that was legally as much hers as Clement's, and bought a seat on the stage to Caldwell. Caldwell was a cattle town, the last major settlement before Indian Territory to the south. In 1882, it was still operating as one of the shipping points for cattle drives coming up the Kishom Trail, though the trail was winding down as the railroad pushed further west. It was rough, loud, and full of the particular energy of a place that knew its best days might be numbered, which made the people in it either desperate or determined, depending on their nature. Sylvie arrived with no connections and no plan, and took a room at Mrs. Adler's boarding house on the strength of the woman's kind face and the smell of something good cooking on the stove inside. "You are not a cattle woman," Mrs. Adler observed, looking her over on the front porch. "No," Sylvie agreed. "Can you teach?" Sylvie blinked. "I can." "The schoolteacher left in July," Mrs. Adler said. "Married a rancher. The town council has been looking for a replacement. Pay is not spectacular, but it is steady." She paused. "If you are looking for steady." Sylvie was looking for exactly that. She said yes, before she had time to talk herself out of it. By the time she encountered York Langley and his destroyed hat, she had already spoken to 2 members of the town council and was fairly certain the position was hers if she wanted it. She had not yet decided if she wanted it. She was still in the mode of deciding nothing, holding her options loosely, not letting herself settle until she was sure the ground was solid. But something shifted that afternoon in the street. In the long moment after York Langley said what he said, she did not answer him right away. She said instead, with her chin up and her voice steady, "I don't know that my staying is the sort of thing that ought to be contingent on your hat, Marshal Langley." "York," he said, "I don't know you well enough to call you York. You know me well enough to judge my hat." She almost laughed again and caught it. "That is a fair point." He looked at her for another moment with that same unreadable expression, and then he touched the brim of the battered hat with 2 fingers, a proper gesture, a small courtesy, and said, "Good afternoon, Miss Zane," she said. "Sylvie Zane." He nodded once, as if filing the name somewhere. "Miss Zane." He walked away. She watched him go and then looked down at the calico and told herself firmly that she was not going to think about that conversation for the rest of the day. She thought about it for the rest of the week. York Langley had been the Marshal of Caldwell for 3 years, which was longer than any of his predecessors had lasted in the role, and long enough that the town had started to think of him as permanent in the way they thought of the water tower and the church bell. He had come to Caldwell from a period of his life he did not discuss in detail, which was his right, and nobody pressed him because pressing York Langley on things he did not want to discuss was an exercise in polite futility. What people knew was this: he had served as a deputy in Dodge City in the late 1870s, under circumstances that had apparently been demanding enough to make Caldwell look restful by comparison. He was 31 years old. He had no wife and no family that anyone knew of. He was fair in his enforcement of the law, firm without being brutal, and possessed of a patience that the cowboys coming up from Texas on the drives found either respectful or infuriating, depending on whether they were sober. He had been shot twice, once in the left shoulder and once in the right thigh, and wore both scars without drama. The hat was something of a legend in Caldwell, though nobody had ever been brave enough to laugh at it to his face before Sylvie Zane. His deputy, a cheerful 26-year-old named Reuben Marsh, had offered opinions on the hat at regular intervals over the course of 3 years and had been consistently ignored. The hat had belonged to York's father. York had been wearing it since the old man died, which was 7 years ago now, and whatever the hat meant to him was not something he had shared with anyone. It was just the hat. It went where he went. It had been to places with him that he did not talk about, and it had come through all of them, battered but still functional, which was perhaps the point. When Reuben found out the following morning that a woman in town had laughed at the hat and York had not fired her on the spot, his eyebrows went up so far they nearly left his face. "What did he do?" Reuben asked Mrs. Adler, because Mrs. Adler's boarding house was the information center of Caldwell, and Mrs. Adler herself was its informal archivist. "He told her he would buy a new hat if she stayed," Mrs. Adler said, with the serene satisfaction of a woman who had witnessed something significant and knew it. Reuben sat with that for a moment. "He said what?" "You heard me." Reuben looked out the window of the boarding house dining room, processing. 7 years, he said. 7 years I have been telling him that hat needs to be retired, and he looks at me like I suggested burning down the church. A woman laughs at it and he offers to buy a new one. Mrs. Adler smiled into her coffee cup. "That is generally how it works, dear." Sylvie took the teaching position. The school was a single room on the east edge of town. 12 desks for students ranging from 6 to 14, a wood stove in the corner, and windows that needed new glass in 2 of the 4 panes. The town council gave her a small salary, the use of the schoolroom, and a list of supplies she was expected to make last the year. She found the work more satisfying than she had expected, the kind of work that filled the hours and gave them shape. And the children were curious, and sometimes trying and exactly the right distraction from everything else. She settled into a routine. Morning school, afternoon preparation, evenings at the boarding house or walking the edges of town where it was quieter. She bought herself a decent winter coat from the dry goods store because October in Kansas was no joke, and she began to feel cautiously like Caldwell might actually work. She saw York Langley regularly because Caldwell was not a large town and the Marshal's office was on the main street, and he walked his rounds every morning at 8 and every evening at dusk. The first few times their paths crossed, they exchanged nods. Then one morning he stopped and asked how the school was going, in the same tone he probably used to ask about road conditions. And she told him it was going fine, in the same tone she would have used to answer that question from the postmaster. But she noticed things about him that she had not intended to notice. She noticed that he was never careless. Every action was considered, even small ones. He watched a room the way experienced men watch rooms, with attention distributed rather than fixed, aware of the edges. He was polite to everyone, genuinely polite rather than performatively so, with the same courtesy to the Mexican vaqueros passing through as to the banker, who clearly considered himself the most important man in the county. He had a particular way of listening when someone spoke to him, a complete stillness, like the words mattered and deserved room to land. She noticed also that he still wore the hat. She had expected, after his extraordinary statement in the street, that the hat would disappear. It had not. It was still there every morning, still splendid in its ruin, still riding the back of his head as though it owned the position. She did not know what to make of that. 3 weeks after she arrived, on a cold Saturday in the middle of October, there was a dance at the Caldwell Grange Hall. Mrs. Adler informed Sylvie at breakfast that attendance was expected of respectable town residents, and that this included new school teachers, and that she should wear something nicer than the gray dress she had been wearing to the store. Sylvie, who had not danced at anything in 2 years and was not sure she remembered how, thought briefly about declining and then thought about the alternative, which was another evening in her room at the boarding house with her own thoughts, and decided against it. She wore the blue dress she had brought from Wichita, the good one with the fitted waist and the white collar, and she put her dark hair up properly and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and thought that she looked like a person who had her life arranged, which was not true, but was nice to imagine. The Grange Hall was lit with lanterns and warm with the body heat of approximately 60 people. There was a fiddle player and a man on the banjo and someone who was enthusiastically sawing away at a washboard, and the music was not refined, but it was enthusiastic, and it made the room feel alive. People were talking and laughing and moving, and there was a table of food along one wall that was being earnestly depleted. She did not immediately see York Langley when she walked in, but she felt the exact moment she located him across the room, the way you sometimes feel a thing before you consciously process it. He was standing near the far wall talking to the blacksmith, a big man named Theodore Graves, and he was wearing his good vest and his badge and a clean white shirt, and on his head was the hat. Of course it was. Their eyes met across the crowd. She felt warmth rise in her face and looked away deliberately, and accepted a cup of cider from Mrs. Adler's husband, and made herself pay attention to the conversation she had been pulled into about the upcoming school curriculum. He came to find her 20 minutes later. She was standing near the food table, having navigated herself away from a very enthusiastic conversation about soil drainage with the farmer next door to the schoolhouse, and she was contemplating a piece of dried apple pie when she became aware of him standing beside her. "Miss Zane," he said. "Marshal Langley," she said, not looking up from the pie. "York," he said, "you keep saying that. It keeps being true." She looked up at him then, and the corner of her mouth moved despite herself. He looked different in the lantern light, or perhaps she was seeing him differently now that she had been looking at him for 3 weeks. The serious face was still serious, but there was something in it that she hadn't quite catalogued before, something that was not as closed as she had initially assumed. "You still have the hat," she said. "I do. I thought you were going to buy a new one." He was quiet for a moment, watching her with those dark eyes. That offer was conditional, he said. She set down the pie she had not eaten. On my staying. Yes, I am staying, she said. I took the teaching position. I know. So by the terms of your offer, the hat stays until you ask me to replace it, he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made the words mean more than they appeared to on their surface. Something careful and patient and entirely serious. She looked at him for a long moment. That is a strange bargain, Marshal. York. York, she said, and it came out quieter than she intended. Something changed in his expression, subtle and significant at once, like the shift in a river's current that you feel before you see it. He held out his hand. Dance with me, Miss Zane. Sylvie, she said, and took his hand. They danced 3 times that night, which was enough that people noticed, which was exactly the number of times in the territory of 1882 that constituted a statement. Sylvie was not unaware of this. She was also not unaware that dancing with York Langley was entirely different from dancing with anyone she had danced with before, and that the difference was something she was going to have to think carefully about later. He was a good dancer, surprisingly so, with the same economical grace he brought to everything he did. He held her with propriety and confidence in equal measure. He did not talk much while they danced, but when he did speak, close enough that she could hear him over the fiddle, what he said was worth listening to. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had been a farmer who had gone west and then gone back, and that York had gone west and not come back, that he had been in Caldwell long enough to care what happened to it, that he had read most of the books in the small lending library that the minister's wife ran out of the rectory. You raid, she said, without meaning to sound surprised. Is that unexpected? He said, not offended, genuinely curious. A little, she admitted. What did you expect? She thought about it honestly. I expected someone harder to know, she said. He was quiet for a beat of the music. I am hard to know, he said. I am just not hard to talk to. She understood the distinction. There were people who were easy to talk to because they were on the surface, and there were people who were easy to talk to because they had learned to be, which was not the same thing at all. She was still thinking about that later, lying in the dark of her room at the boarding house while the town settled into its nighttime quiet, and she told herself very firmly that this was not the time for complications. She was in a new place, building a new life from nothing. She had just taken a job that would keep her solvent and occupied. She had exactly zero capacity for whatever was happening with York Langley, and his ruined hat, and his patient eyes, and his offer that was still technically on the table. She thought about it anyway. November came in cold and earnest, the way it does on the Kansas plains, where there is nothing between you and the wind but open grass stretching all the way to wherever the sky begins. The cattle season was winding down, and the town was settling into its winter mode, quieter and more contained. The transient population of cowboys and drivers and drifters thinning to a steadier residual of people who actually lived there. Sylvie found the school came into its own in those colder months. The children were more focused inside with the wood stove going, and she had gotten to know them as individuals well enough to adapt to what each one needed. There was a boy named Edmond who was brilliant with arithmetic, but could not be made to sit still for reading, and a girl named Clara who read everything she could get her hands on, and was quietly terrified of anyone noticing how smart she was. There were the Reyes brothers, Pablo and Mateo, 9 and 11, who spoke English with an accent and were treated with occasional cruelty by a few of the other children, which Sylvie addressed directly and without ambiguity the first time she witnessed it. She was, in short, becoming part of the place. She felt it happening around her like a slow accretion, like the way a tree gradually becomes part of the forest it grows up in. York Langley was part of this accretion. Not in any way she had engineered or even consciously chosen, but in the way that a person who walks the same streets as you, at the same hours, in a town of 2,000 people, becomes woven into the fabric of your days whether you invite them or not. He had taken to stopping at the school once or twice a week, always at the end of the day when the children had gone, initially on the pretext of checking that the building was secure. The first time he did this, Sylvie had looked at the solid wooden door and the equally solid wooden walls and said, "It seems fine to me," and he had said, "These old buildings can have issues," and she had said, "What kind of issues?" And he had run out of answer, and they had both known what was actually happening, and after that, they dropped the pretense and he simply came. They talked. That was mostly what they did. They sat in the cold classroom with their coats on and they talked about the school and the town and the things they had read and the things they thought about. And these conversations had a quality she had not encountered before, a sense of depth that was also a kind of ease. He listened the way she had noticed him listening, with his full attention, and he thought before he spoke. And when he said something, it was the thing he actually meant. He told her, gradually in pieces, about Dodge City, about the years before Caldwell. It was not a clean story. Dodge City in the mid-1870s had been one of the roughest cattle towns in the West, and being a deputy, there had meant witnessing and sometimes participating in things that left marks. He had seen men die. He had been the reason men died, on at least 2 occasions, and this was not something he carried lightly. The law on the frontier was not a clean instrument. It was blunt and imperfect, and sometimes the person holding it made mistakes, and York Langley had made some of his early in his career and spent years since understanding what they had cost. "You regret coming out here?" Sylvie asked him one November afternoon, with the wind making the schoolhouse walls creak. He thought about it in the way he thought about things, all the way down. "No," he said, "not coming out here, some of what I did out here." He looked at the cold stove. "But you cannot unlive a thing. You can only carry it different." She understood that better than he might have expected. She told him about Clement, about the farm, about the 2 years of trying to hold something together that had already been let go, about the shame of the failure, even though it was not her failure, the way you absorb the failures of people you are responsible to as though they are your own, about the morning the bank man came and the feeling that had hardened in her, the decision to stop waiting. "That took courage," he said. "It took desperation," she corrected. "Those are often the same thing," he said. She looked at him across the schoolroom in the gray November light and felt something she had been trying not to feel since the dance. She had been avoiding the word for it, the way you avoid looking directly at something bright. But sitting there in the cold room with this serious, careful, unexpectedly tender man, she let herself look at it. She was falling in love with him. The recognition was not thrilling so much as it was terrifying, because she was not the kind of woman who fell in love without weighing what it cost, and she had a clear sense of the possible losses involved. He was the marshal of a rough Western town. She was a school teacher with no roots here yet, still feeling the ground for its solidity. Whatever this was, it could break in a dozen different directions, and she had already survived one large breaking and was not eager for another. She said none of this. She pulled her coat closer and asked what he was reading, and they talked about Walter Scott until the light faded outside and she had to light the lamp. And then he stood up and put on his hat, and she almost laughed at it again, because it really was objectively ridiculous, and stopped herself out of something that was not quite the same as the first time she had stopped herself. It was something closer to affection. In December, her brother Clement came to Caldwell. She did not know he was coming, and she would not have wanted him to come, and when Mrs. Adler knocked on her door at 7 in the evening and said there was a young man in the front parlor asking for her. She knew with the particular intuition of people who have been managing disasters for years exactly what she was walking into. Clement was 27 and had their father's long face and their mother's brown eyes and an expression of beleaguered innocence that Sylvie had learned over years to distrust thoroughly. He was sitting in Mrs. Adler's parlor with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had ridden a long way and was hoping the distance of the journey would count in his favor. "Sylvie," he said, standing when she came in. "Clement," she said. "You are looking well," he said. "Why are you here?" He did the thing with his expression, the shift toward something vulnerable which was not entirely manufactured, she knew, because Clement was not entirely dishonest, just selectively so. "I needed to see you were all right," he said. "I wrote you a letter telling you I was all right. I wanted to see in person." She sat down across from him and looked at him carefully. He met her gaze for about 3 seconds before his eyes drifted toward the window. "What do you need, Clement?" He talked for 20 minutes. The shape of it was this. He had not, in the 2 months since the farm was sold, done anything useful with his share of the proceeds. He had intended to. There had been a business opportunity in Wichita that had seemed promising and had turned out, as business opportunities presented to Clement always turned out, to be less than it appeared. He was not, technically, in trouble. He was adjacent to trouble. He thought that if he could perhaps— "No," Sylvie said. "I have not even finished. You were going to ask me to loan you money, and the answer is no." He looked hurt. He was probably genuinely hurt. She remembered being 10 years old, and Clement being 14, and believing everything he told her with a whole heart. And she had a clear sense of the distance between that child and this woman sitting in a boarding house parlor in Caldwell, Kansas. And the distance was enormous, and she had crossed every inch of it herself. "I am building something here," she said. "I cannot undo it to help you manage a situation you created. I did not create the farm debt. You made it worse, and you know it." She was not angry, just clear. "I will give you $10 for a coach fare to wherever you are going next and a meal at the hotel, and that is what I can do." Clement was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the look of a man accepting a reality he had been hoping would be otherwise. They had dinner at the hotel dining room, Clement and Sylvie, and it was strained at first and then gradually easier, because whatever Clement was and wasn't, he was her brother, and she had loved him for 23 years, and that was not nothing. By the end of the meal, they were talking more like themselves, like the siblings they had been before circumstance complicated everything, and she was glad she had not sent him away hungry. York Langley walked past the hotel window while they were eating and saw her through the glass. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, and she raised one back, and Clement watched this exchange with interest. "Who is that?" he said. "The town marshal," she said. Clement looked after him thoughtfully. "He knows you. We are acquainted," Sylvie said, reaching for her coffee. Clement looked at her for a moment with the shrewdness he occasionally deployed when he was paying attention. "Just acquainted," he said. "Eat your dinner, Clement," she said. Clement left the next morning. He shook her hand at the stage and then unexpectedly hugged her, a brief and real thing. "I am sorry about the farm," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I am going to try to do better." She was not sure she believed him, but she chose to. "I know that too," she said. She watched the stage pull away and stood in the street for a moment afterward with the December wind on her face, feeling the old familiar tangle of emotions that Clement always left in his wake: love and frustration, and grief for the version of things that had never quite worked out. And then she put it away, because she had learned how to put things away, and she walked toward the schoolhouse to prepare for the next day. York found her there an hour later when he came by on his evening walk. "Was that family?" he said, coming in the door. "My brother," she said, without looking up from the papers she was marking. He sat in the chair he had come to occupy in these late afternoon visits, the one nearest the stove. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and then, because it was York and because she had learned that she could be honest with him, "No, not entirely. I will be." He said nothing, which was the right thing to say. He simply sat there, present and steady, while she finished marking the papers, and then they talked about other things. And by the time the lamp burned low, she was actually all right, as she had said she would be, partly because of time and partly because of the particular quality of his company. She looked at him across the room, the ruined hat on the table beside him because he had taken it off when he came in, something she had noticed he always did inside, and she thought about the impossible arithmetic of this thing happening between them. She was a woman with no family but a brother who kept falling down, no home she had not had to leave, no position more than a few months old. He was a man with a dangerous job in a rough town, a past he had described in terms of weight, a patience she sometimes thought might be armor. And yet she felt safer in this room with him than she had felt anywhere in 2 years. "York," she said. He looked at her. She could not say the thing she was thinking. It was too soon and too large, and she was not ready. But she could say something adjacent to it, something that let a little of the truth out without opening the whole door at once. "I am glad I stayed," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "So am I," he said, and it came out with a weight that matched what she had been trying to express, and she understood that they were both circling the same thing from different sides, and that the space between them was getting smaller in the specific way that it gets smaller between two people who are trying to be careful with something they are afraid to break. The thing that changed it was the snow. There was a blizzard in mid-December, the kind of storm that Kansas delivers with thorough cruelty, 3 days of it, with wind that made the roads impassable and the streets something to be navigated at risk. School was closed. The boarding house became its own small world, Mrs. Adler cooking steadily, and everyone gathered in the common rooms for warmth. York was not at the boarding house. He was at the Marshal's office, where he spent the nights of bad weather in case someone needed help, sleeping on the cot in the back room and keeping the stove going. Reuben was there too during the days, and they managed a handful of emergencies over the 3 days. A man caught in the storm trying to reach the livery, a family in one of the outlying houses who needed fuel. On the second day of the storm, when the wind was at its worst, Sylvie looked out her boarding house window at the main street and saw a lamp on in the Marshal's office, and did not think too carefully about what she was doing before she wrapped herself in her heavy coat and scarf and went across the street through the snow. He answered the knock immediately, as though he had been listening for something. "Sylvie," he said, not using the formal address which he rarely did anymore in private. His face, in the cold lamplight of the office doorway, was surprised and something else. "You should not have come out in this." "I brought food," she said, because Mrs. Adler had pressed a covered pot and a wrapped bundle of bread into her hands when she saw her heading for the door. "And I wanted to make sure you were not frozen." He let her in, and she stood in the small, warm office, stamping snow from her boots while he locked the door behind her against the wind. The office was simple: 2 desks, a gun cabinet, a stove, a wall of wanted notices, and through an open door at the back, the cot where he had been sleeping. It smelled like wood smoke and leather, and something else she could not quite name. Reuben had gone home in the brief lull of the morning, so they were alone. She unpacked the food and they ate at the Marshal's desk, across from each other, with the storm making the windows shake in their frames and the stove radiating steady warmth. They talked for a long time. The intimacy of it was not lost on her. This small closed space, the extreme weather outside, the two of them occupying the same lamplight. But it was not uncomfortable, which said something about how much had shifted between them in 2 months of careful, patient accumulation. "Tell me about the hat," she said, at some point in the evening. He had been expecting it, she thought, or something like it. He looked at the hat where it hung on the peg by the door and did not say anything for a moment. "My father bought it in Missouri," he said, "when I was about 12. He was the kind of man who wore things out before he replaced them, not because he could not afford better, but because he did not see the value in replacing something that still served. He wore that hat for 15 years. He paused. He died 7 years ago. I had been gone from home for 4 years by then, and I was not there when it happened. The weight of that was quiet in the room. I was in Dodge City," he said. "Word reached me too late for me to get back before they buried him. My mother sent me his things. The hat was in the bundle." He looked at it a moment longer. "I started wearing it because it was the only thing of his I had with me. I kept wearing it because—" He stopped. "Because," she said gently. "Because I was not there," he said. "And I did not know how to account for that, so I kept something of his close." "Foolish, probably." "No," she said, with a certainty that surprised her by how quickly it came. "Not foolish at all." He looked at her then, directly, the guard she usually saw around his eyes completely absent. It was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and it was almost too much to look at, like looking at the sun sideways. "I never told anyone that," he said. "I know," she said. They sat in the lamplight of the Marshal's office while the blizzard battered the windows of Caldwell, and the distance that had been closing between them finished closing. And when she reached across the desk and put her hand over his, he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. She stayed until the storm eased enough that walking was reasonable, and then he walked her back across the street through the knee-deep snow, and at the door of the boarding house he stopped with his hand still in hers. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. "I want to call on you properly," he said. "Not just at the school, not just by coincidence. I want to come to the boarding house and speak to you in front of people, where it is clear what I am doing." She looked up at him in the dark, with snow in her hair and her heart beating with a speed she found both alarming and entirely appropriate to the moment. "What are you doing?" she said. "Courting you," he said. "If you will let me." She was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then she said, "York." "Yes." "Go get some sleep," she said, "and come to Sunday dinner at Mrs. Adler's the day after tomorrow." She saw the thing that moved across his face then, the same thing she was feeling, something large and warm and quietly exhilarating. "Yes, madam," he said, and his voice was different, lower and full of something he had been holding for a long time. She went inside. She stood in the front hall of the boarding house with her back against the closed door and let herself feel it all the way down, the terrifying, magnificent reality of what was happening. And she pressed her hands over her face and breathed. And then she smiled into her palms in the dark where nobody could see her. Mrs. Adler, coming out of the kitchen with a lamp, saw her anyway. "Well," the old woman said, with the composure of someone who had predicted this exact development 6 weeks ago. "Good night, Mrs. Adler," Sylvie said, and went upstairs to her room. Sunday dinner at Mrs. Adler's was the social event of the week in the winter months, attended by the boarders and by a rotating cast of town residents who had no family or whose family Mrs. Adler had adopted out of her particular brand of determined warmth. York came at noon and sat across the table from Sylvie and ate pot roast and drank coffee, and talked to the other boarders with the same careful courtesy he brought to everything. And the whole thing was terrifyingly domestic, and she liked it so much it scared her. Reuben was there because he boarded at Mrs. Adler's, and he watched York across the table with an expression of quiet astonishment, like a man watching the laws of physics bend and trying to recalibrate his understanding of the universe. Afterward, when York and Sylvie were sitting in the parlor and Mrs. Adler was conveniently keeping everyone else in the dining room, Reuben leaned in the doorway for a moment with his coffee cup and said, "I just want to say, Miss Zane, that in 3 years I have never seen him sit in a parlor on a Sunday voluntarily. Ever." "Thank you, Reuben," York said without looking up. "Just making an observation," Reuben said, retreating. Sylvie laughed, and York, watching her laugh, looked like a man who had found something he had not known he was looking for. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them, the specific pleasant rhythm of a courtship conducted by two people who were old enough to be honest about what they were doing. He came on Sundays and walked with her in the evenings when his rounds allowed it. And in the cold December dark of Kansas, they walked the town together and talked about everything and nothing, accumulating the 1,000 small details of each other's lives that become, over time, the architecture of intimacy. She told him about her mother, who had died when Sylvie was 15, from pneumonia, and who had been the most capable and quietly fierce woman she had ever known. She told him about learning to manage the farm accounts because her father's eyesight was beginning to fail, and he had trusted her with the ledgers before Clement, because Clement would not sit still long enough. She told him about wanting, for a long time, to be a teacher, and the way that want had been set aside year after year in favor of what was necessary. He told her about Missouri before the West, about the older brother who had stayed and farmed the same land their father had, and who sent letters, sometimes with the particular awkwardness of men who have lived in different worlds too long to close the gap in letters. He told her about Dodge City in terms of what it had taught him, which was a great deal about human nature at extremes, and what it had cost him, which he was precise and honest about without being melodramatic. He told her what he wanted, which was simple and specific, to do his work well, to be good at it, to build something in this town that lasted. "You want," she started, one evening and then stopped. They were standing outside the boarding house, at the end of a walk, with the night clear and cold above them and the first stars of a western winter spreading overhead in a way that always surprised people who came from places with more trees. "What?" he said. "A family," she said. "Children." "Do you want that?" He looked at her. The question hung in the cold air between them, explicit now, its implications visible. "Yes," he said. "I have thought I probably wanted that for a long time, but I have not let myself think about it seriously until recently." "Recently," she said. "Since October," he said. "Since a woman I did not know laughed at my hat in the middle of the main street, and I said something that surprised me almost as much as it surprised her." She looked up at him. "That was 30 seconds of knowing me." "Sometimes 30 seconds is enough to know something," he said. He reached out and tucked a loose piece of her hair back from her face, slowly, careful as everything he did. "I have spent the last 2 months making sure I was not wrong. I was not wrong." She caught his hand where it had rested briefly against her hair and held it against her cheek for a moment, feeling the warmth of it against the cold air. "York, Sylvie, I am still afraid," she said. "I want you to know that. I am not saying yes to something and pretending it is simple when it is not." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to pretend anything." "What are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment, searching her face with those careful eyes. "I am asking if you will let me keep trying," he said, "to be what I want to be for you, to earn it." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars were very bright. The cold was sharp and clean on her face. She felt the ground beneath her feet, solid Kansas earth that she had chosen on a desperate September morning for no better reason than it was far enough away, and she thought about what the ground had turned out to contain. "You have already earned quite a lot," she said. He kissed her then, for the first time, standing outside Mrs. Adler's boarding house in the December dark, brief and careful, and with the fullness of everything they had been building in it. And it was nothing like anything she had experienced before, which was the only way she had of measuring it. She went inside with her heart going at a pace that would have alarmed a physician and stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment, and thought with complete and clear conviction, "I am going to marry this man." The thought was not frightening. That was what surprised her. For a woman who had been frightened of nearly everything since September, the thought of York Langley was not frightening. It was solid. It was warm. It was, of all things, restful. January was the month she met his past. It came not in the form of a secret she had not known about, but in the form of a man named Gideon Falk, who arrived in Caldwell on a gray morning in the second week of January and went directly to the Marshal's office with the deliberate walk of a man who knows where he is going and why. Sylvie was at the school and knew nothing about this. She learned about it from Reuben, who came to the schoolhouse at noon looking like he was not sure how to arrange his face. "Gideon Falk is in town," he said. She looked up from her desk. "Who is that?" Reuben thought about how to say it. "He is from Dodge City. From before York came here, he paused. "There was a shooting in Dodge in 1878, a man named Falk, Rory Falk. He was drunk and he came at York with a weapon and York shot him in self-defense. It was ruled justified." He paused again. "Gideon is Rory's brother." The classroom was very quiet. "What does he want?" Sylvie said. "He says he just wants to talk," Reuben said. "He has been in the Marshal's office with York for 2 hours. She dismissed the children early, to the open delight of every student present, and walked to the Marshal's office and knocked on the door. York answered it. He looked the way he looked when he was managing something difficult, controlled and still, his face doing the careful work of not showing what was behind it. He looked at her and something shifted, ever so slightly. "Gideon Falk is here," he said, stepping back to let her in. The man sitting across from York's desk was perhaps 35, lean and dark-haired, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years outdoors. He stood when Sylvie came in, which was a mannered gesture she had not expected. "Gideon Falk," he said. "Sylvie Zane," she said. "I am a friend of Marshal Langley's." Falk looked at her, and then at York and then back at her, with an expression she could not entirely read. "He told me about you," he said, which surprised her. She sat down in the chair against the wall because she was not leaving, and she looked at York, who looked back at her with gratitude in his eyes, visible and real. Falk talked for another hour. What emerged was not vengeance. It was grief, which was different and, in its way, harder. Rory Falk had been the younger brother, the troubled one, the one who drank too much and made bad choices, the one who Gideon had spent years trying to help and failing. He had died in a saloon in Dodge City with a pistol in his hand, and the decision that ended his life had been his own, made in a moment of drunken rage. The inquiry had cleared York completely. Gideon had spent 4 years not at peace with this. Not because he believed York had done wrong, but because his brother was dead and someone had to have been part of that. And the Marshal who had pulled the trigger was a specific and locatable person in a way that the confluence of circumstances that had actually killed Rory was not. "I needed to see you," Gideon said to York at the end. "I do not know why. I thought I was angry. I came here angry." He looked at his hands. "I am not sure I am angry anymore." York was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry about your brother," he said, with the directness of a man who had said this before to himself in the years since. "What happened was justified by the law. It was not what I wanted." Gideon was quiet. Then he nodded, a slow movement, something settling in him that had evidently been unsettled for a long time. He shook York's hand. He nodded to Sylvie. He left. The office was quiet after the door closed. Sylvie looked at York, who stood with his back to the gun cabinet looking at the closed door. "Are you all right?" she said. He turned to look at her. "Yes," he said. Then, "I am glad you came." "I am glad I came too," she said. She crossed the office and stood close to him, close enough that the warmth of him was perceptible in the cold room, and she looked up at his face, which was carrying more weight today than usual. She reached up and straightened the lapel of his coat, a small, unnecessary gesture that had everything to do with needing to touch him. "York," she said. "Yes." "The hat," she said. Something in his face loosened, a fraction of the weight lifting. "What about it?" he said. "I want you to buy a new one," she said. He went very still. "Not to replace him," she said carefully. "Not to erase what it means, but because—" She stopped and found the words. "Because you were not there when he died and you have been carrying that. And I think carrying his hat all these years has been a way of staying with the guilt of it, and you do not need to stay with the guilt anymore. You have been a good man. You are a good man. Your father would know that." The silence between them was very full. His jaw worked, just once, the way jaws work when the muscles are doing emotional containment work. He looked down at her with an expression she had no word for, something beyond gratitude, beyond affection, something that was perhaps simply the face of love seen clearly for the first time. "Sylvie," he said. "I know," she said. He put his arms around her carefully, and she put hers around him, and they stood in the cold Marshal's office holding on to each other in the silence of a January afternoon, while Caldwell went about its business outside the frosted window. Spring came the way it comes to Kansas, in fits and arguments, warm days followed by freezing nights, the prairie grass coming up green and then getting flattened by late frost and coming up again. By March, the school was louder and more restless, the children channeling the season's energy in ways that required creative management. By April, the cattle drives were starting to come through again from the south, and Caldwell was filling back up with the transient population that gave the town its edge. York bought the hat in February. He drove to Wichita on a Tuesday, which was a slow day for law enforcement, leaving Reuben in charge with the air of a man who was not doing anything significant, and came back the next day with a proper black Stetson, well made and shaped correctly, with a clean hatband and a brim that lay flat the way brim ought to lie. He came to the schoolhouse after the children left, and he stood in the doorway with the new hat on his head, and Sylvie looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "Well," he said. "It suits you," she said. "It is a good hat." "It is," he agreed. "What did you do with the old one?" He looked at her. "I kept it," he said. "In the box the new one came in. I am not throwing it away." "I would not have asked you to," she said. He looked at her, in the April light of the schoolroom, with the new hat on his head and the ease in his face that she had been watching grow over 5 months of days. She had become so familiar with the sight of him, the specific arrangement of this particular human being, that she could not remember with any accuracy what the world had looked like before it contained him in this proportion. "Sylvie," he said. "York. I want to marry you," he said. It was not the most elaborate proposal ever delivered on the Kansas plains. It did not come with flowers or a speech or a moonlit backdrop. It came in a schoolroom that smelled like chalk and wood smoke, from a man who had thought about it long enough to be sure, offered with the same direct simplicity that he brought to everything he said. She looked at him for a moment and thought about everything she had been afraid of in October, the ways this could break, the ground she had not been sure was solid. She thought about January and December, and the blizzard and Sunday dinners and cold evening walks and everything they had said to each other in rooms full of lamplight. She was not afraid anymore. Yes, she said. They were married in May at the Caldwell church with Mrs. Adler crying happily from the front pew, and Reuben standing up with York looking like a man who had been vindicated in some fundamental belief. The minister was brief and sincere. York wore his good vest and his new hat and the tin star that he removed for the duration of the ceremony and replaced immediately after, because it was a habit deep as breathing. Sylvie wore her blue dress, the same one she had worn to the Grange Hall dance in October, because it was the dress she had been wearing when things started to be possible. And she was the kind of woman who noticed what she wore on important occasions. They moved into a small house on the north side of town, 2 blocks from the school and 4 from the Marshal's office, with a porch that faced west and a kitchen that caught the morning sun. York built shelves in the front room for Sylvie's books, and Sylvie planted 4 things in the yard in the first week: a rose bush, 2 lilac bushes, and a kitchen garden. The summer of 1883 was busy and good. The cattle drives were at their peak, and Caldwell was full and loud, and York worked long days managing the particular chaos of a town that was also a transit point for the end of a long trail. He was good at his job in the way that people are good at things they are also naturally suited to: the patience and the steadiness finding their right application in the work. Sylvie finished her 2nd school year and started planning for her 3rd. She was known in town by now, genuinely known, the kind of person that has become attached to a place by the accumulation of small bonds. She knew the families of her students and the preferences of the merchants and which of the vaqueros who camped south of town were interested in learning to read English, which 3 of them were, and she taught them in the evenings twice a week on the school porch because that was who she was. In September, a year after she had arrived in Caldwell with $42 and no plan, she discovered she was pregnant. She told York on a Tuesday evening. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a report he was writing, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and told him, watching his face. He put down the pen. He got up from the table and crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face carefully, the way he touched everything he was careful with, and he looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. He kissed her forehead. He held her for a long time in the kitchen without speaking, and she felt the weight of what this meant to him in the quality of his stillness, in the steadiness of the arms around her. "I wanted this," he said finally, quietly against her hair. "I know you did," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her. "We are going to be fine," he said, not as a hope but as a fact he intended to make true. "I know that too," she said. Their son was born in April of 1884, on a morning that came in warm and clear after a week of rain, as though the season had been working up to something. He was healthy and loud from the first moment, and York held him with the careful astonishment of a man for whom the experience of holding something this important and this fragile was entirely new territory. They named him Walter, after Sylvie's father, and then argued companionably for 2 weeks about his middle name before settling on James, which had been York's father's name, and both of them felt the symmetry of this so completely that no further argument was possible. Walter James Langley was a good-natured child who slept when he was supposed to and ate when he was supposed to and regarded the world, from a very early age, with an interested calm that he had inherited from his father with such precision that Reuben, meeting him at 2 months old, looked at York and said, "That is your expression exactly," which York took as a compliment. The years settled into themselves with the particular comfortable weight of lives that have found their shape. York remained the Marshal and became, over time, something of an institution in Caldwell. He was reappointed by successive town councils without serious opposition, which was partly because he was good at the job and partly because after a few years, no one could quite imagine the town without him in it. He managed the winding down of the cattle drive era with the same steadiness he had brought to its peak, adapting to the changing town without losing what he was. He helped organize the expansion of the school in 1885, when the original single room was no longer adequate, lobbying the town council with the patient persistence of a man who had learned that most things worth having require more than one ask. The new two-room schoolhouse was built in the spring, and Sylvie stood on its new porch on the first day and felt a satisfaction she could not put entirely into words, not just at the building but at the path that had led to it. She taught in Caldwell for 11 years. She watched her first students grow up, saw Edmund the restless mathematician become a surveyor who rode the Kansas plains with instruments, and an appetite for numbers that had been fed and directed rather than dismissed. She watched Clara, the quiet reader, become a woman who ran the lending library that outgrew the rectory and eventually occupied its own small building on the main street. She watched the Ray's brothers grow into capable young men who were exactly as much a part of Caldwell as anyone whose family had been there longer, which she counted as something she had contributed to in a small way, by the insistence she had brought to their right to be there. Their second child was a daughter, born in the winter of 1886. They named her Alina, which was York's mother's name, and she was a different kind of person than Walter from her very first weeks, louder and more insistent and possessed of an opinion about everything she encountered, which Sylvie suspected was related to herself rather than to York, a theory she kept largely to herself. Alina at 3 could manage adults twice her age with a combination of charm and absolute determination that made York look at her sometimes with an expression that combined paternal fondness with the wariness of a professional whose skills were being outmatched. Reuben, who had by this point gotten married himself and had 2 children of his own, declared Alina Langley the most formidable child he had personally encountered, which was saying something since Reuben had encountered a great many children. In 1887, a letter came from Missouri. It was from York's brother Daniel, and it was longer and less stilted than the previous letters had been, written with the air of a man who had decided to close a distance that had been allowed to grow too large. Daniel was in good health. His wife was well. They had 4 children. He wanted to know, in terms more direct than he had previously permitted himself, whether York would consider visiting. York sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time. Sylvie watched him from across the room. Walter, 3 years old, was asleep in the next room, and Alina, not quite 1, was in the crib near the stove, making the small exploratory sounds that babies make when they are awake and interested in their world. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking about whether I am afraid to go," he said, with the honesty he brought to everything. "Are you?" He considered it. "A little," he said. "I have been away from home for a long time. It is not entirely comfortable to go back to a place that knew you before you were." He paused, looking for the word. "Yourself," she offered. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his shoulder, looking at the letter. "I would like to meet your brother," she said. He looked up at her. "Would you?" "Yes. And I think your father would have wanted you to." He was quiet. Then he put his hand over hers where it rested on his shoulder. They went to Missouri in the summer of 1887. York and Sylvie and Walter, who was old enough to find trains tremendously exciting and made the trip worthwhile on the basis of his enthusiasm alone. Elinor stayed in Caldwell with Mrs. Adler, who had retired from the boarding house the previous year, but maintained strong opinions about being useful, and regarded the temporary custody of Elinor Langley as both an honor and a reasonable test of her endurance. Daniel Langley was taller than York and broader, with the build of a man who had spent decades farming, and he had the same steady eyes and the same careful way of holding himself, which told Sylvie something about where York's nature had come from. Daniel's wife, Margaret, was a warm and practical woman who had clearly already decided to like Sylvie on the basis of the letters York had written, which Daniel had read to her, and which had apparently conveyed enough to form a positive opinion. The visit was 5 days and was not simple, because the history between the brothers was not simple. The years of absence and the loaded silence of letters that had not said what they meant. But it was good. The specific difficulty of it was the right kind. The kind that comes from people who care about each other working through what time has made complicated. And by the 3rd day, something had eased between York and Daniel that Sylvie could feel without being able to name it precisely. On the 4th afternoon, York went with Daniel to visit their parents' graves. He came back in the early evening with the look he had when something had moved in him, settled and open at the same time. He sat on the porch of Daniel's house and Sylvie sat beside him and Walter played in the yard with Daniel's children, and the Missouri summer evening came down warm and full of crickets. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and then, "I told him I was sorry for not being here." "How did he take it?" He said he had not needed me here. He said what he had needed was not to lose me completely, that the distance was what hurt, not the absence at the time. He paused. He was right. She took his hand. He looked out over the yard where his nephew was teaching Walter something involving a stick and a great deal of enthusiasm. "I am glad we came," he said. "I knew you would be," she said. He looked at her, sideways, with the particular expression he had developed over 5 years of marriage for occasions when she had been right about something he had been uncertain of. "You are very sure of things for someone who arrived in Caldwell with no plan," he said. "I had a plan," she said. "It was just flexible." He made the sound he made in place of a laugh when he was trying to maintain dignity, a low exhale through his nose, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and they sat watching the children play in the summer evening light. They went back to Caldwell. The years continued. In 1889, the Indian Territory to the south of Caldwell opened for settlement with the land run, which changed the character of the region significantly and brought a new wave of people through town. York managed the increased traffic and tension with the same steadiness he always brought, and Caldwell adapted and changed around him and Sylvie the way towns do, never the same place twice, but always recognizably itself. Reuben Marsh was appointed deputy marshal permanently, and then, when York began to think about what came after, was eventually trained to take over. This was not a plan York had when he arrived, but one that developed naturally over the years, the understanding that a man who has built something has a responsibility to ensure it continues. Their 3rd child was born in 1890. A boy, which Walter, now 6, greeted with the equanimity of someone who had already accommodated one sibling and was prepared for additional complications. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular, because by the 3rd child they were less concerned with tradition and more concerned with what felt right, and Thomas felt right. Thomas was a quiet, serious baby who regarded the world with an expression that Reuben, encountering him at 6 weeks, declared was identical to York's default expression. which prompted an extended family conversation about what that expression actually communicated, which conversation was ultimately more entertaining than conclusive. Sylvie stepped back from full-time teaching in 1891, partly to be home with 3 children under 8 and partly because there was now a second teacher in the 2-room school, a young woman from Ohio named Harriet, who was as competent as Sylvie and considerably more patient with arithmetic, which Sylvie had always found challenging to teach despite finding the subject itself interesting. She remained on the school board and consulted with Harriet regularly, and taught several of the evening literacy classes herself, because that was the work she found she could not put down entirely. Mrs. Adler, by this time, had taken to spending most of her afternoons at the Langley house, which was less like a visit and more like a residency, and which suited everyone involved perfectly. She was fond of all 3 children in different ways, practical with Thomas's digestive requirements, engaged with Walter's mathematical questions, and magnificently unintimidated by Aline's personality, which made her Aline's favorite adult after her parents. "You are better with her than I am sometimes," Sylvie told Mrs. Adler one afternoon. "She is like you," Mrs. Adler said, which Sylvie took a moment to process and then accepted as the affection it was clearly intended to be. In 1893, a letter came from Clement. He was in Colorado. He had been working for a mining operation near Denver and had, against all expectation including his own, managed to save enough money to buy into a small ranch. He had married a woman named Vera the previous year. He was doing, he wrote, better than he had any right to expect, and he thought Sylvie should know that. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again, slowly, looking for the Clement she knew in the words. She found him, but she also found something else, someone who had perhaps actually done the thing he had always meant to do, which was grow up enough to stop falling down. She wrote him back a long letter. She told him about the children, about York, about the school and the house, and what Caldwell had become to her. She told him she was glad he was well. She told him she was proud of him, because she thought he needed to hear it from someone who had known him when he was not easy to be proud of, and because she meant it. He wrote back. The correspondence became regular. 2 years later, Clement and Vera came to Caldwell with their infant son for a visit, and it was one of the stranger and more tender things Sylvie had experienced. Watching her brother sit at her table in her kitchen in the life she had built and look at her, with the particular expression of someone who has finally understood something they had taken a long time to grasp. "You were right to leave," he said to her quietly, while York was outside with Walter and Aline was entertaining Vera with her standard performance of being Aline. "I know," Sylvie said. "I am sorry it took me so long to say it," he said. "We are both here," she said. "That is what matters." York came back in from outside with Walter, who was 10 by this time and had his father's measured quality already forming, and the kitchen was full of people she loved in various degrees and configurations, and she stood at the stove making coffee and felt the particular fullness of a moment that contains everything you did not know you were working toward. In 1895, York retired as Marshal of Caldwell. He did not retire entirely from anything, which would have been foreign to his nature, but from the specific daily demands of the office, which he handed to Reuben with a formality appropriate to the occasion, and a handshake that meant more than it looked. He continued to serve as a justice of the peace, which suited him, and he did some consulting work for the county that took him to Wichita occasionally. He was 44 years old. Sylvie was 36. Walter was 11. Aline was 9. Thomas was 5. He was, she thought, exactly the same person he had been when she first saw him crossing the street in his ruined hat, and completely different, which was the only way growth works. The patience was still there, the steadiness, the quality of attention. But something had opened that had been closed, some long-held tension in him that had been very gradually released over 13 years of being known by someone who loved him specifically, including the parts of him that were difficult to know. "York," she said one evening on the porch in the September air. It was September again, which was always the time of year that carried the most meaning for her. Walter and Alina were inside doing their schoolwork and Thomas was asleep. "Yes," he said. "Do you know what I was thinking about today? Tell me." "The first day. October 1882. You coming out of the Marshal's office." She looked out at the darkening street. "I had been in this town for days and I knew no one and I had no particular reason to think anything was going to work out. And you walked across the street and said you would buy a new hat if I stayed." He was quiet, listening, the way he always listened. "I did not know," she said, "that you were going to be the reason everything worked out. You would have managed without me," he said. "Probably," she said. "But managing is not the same as this." He looked at her in the September evening, at the face he had been looking at for 13 years and had not finished looking at. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair. "No," he said. "It is not." The stars were coming out over the Kansas plain. The town was settling into its evening sounds, the distant noise of the hotel, a dog somewhere, the ordinary music of a place that has become itself after enough time and enough living. She looked at his hat, the new one, the one he had worn for 12 years now, which was no longer new but was well maintained and properly shaped, and had developed its own character through use and weather and the ordinary passage of time. "It is a good hat," she said. He looked at it where it hung on the peg by the front door, visible through the open window. "It is," he said. "Your father would have liked it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I think he would have liked you," he said. "He was particular about people. He would have seen what you are." "What am I?" she said. He looked at her with the full attention he had given her since October 1882, the kind of attention that makes a person feel both seen and safe, which is a combination rarer than it ought to be. "The best thing I ever said yes to," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the house they had lived in for 12 years, in the town where everything that mattered had started in a moment of laughter, and the evening came down over Kansas warm and full of stars. Inside, Alina had abandoned her schoolwork and was singing something tunelessly to herself, and Walter had apparently decided to assist Thomas with a nighttime glass of water, judging by the sound of footsteps across the kitchen floor. The ordinary sounds of a house that contained people who loved each other and made noise doing it. "We should go in," Sylvie said, without moving. "We should," York said, without moving either. They stayed a little longer on the porch in the September night, while the stars spread out overhead the way they do over flat country, unhurried and complete, and the town went about its quiet evening, and the life they had built from one moment of surprised laughter and one simple, extraordinary offer continued exactly as it was, whole and steady and more than either of them had known how to hope for when they were still the people they had been before they found each other. In the years that followed, Alina Langley grew up exactly as formidably as predicted and became a lawyer, which was not common for women in 1910, but was exactly as common as Alina's determination made it, and which she accomplished with the same combination of intelligence and absolute refusal to accept limitation that had characterized her since infancy. She married a man from Topeka, who was smart enough to recognize that being married to Alina Langley was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and generous enough to say so often. Walter Langley became a surveyor, which had been apparent since Edmund the restless mathematician had shown him what the work involved when Walter was 9, and never looked back. He mapped portions of Oklahoma Territory and later New Mexico, and came home to Caldwell for holidays with the weathered look of someone who has spent most of his life outdoors and considers this entirely reasonable. Thomas Langley, the quiet and serious one, became a doctor, which surprised and then did not surprise anyone who had watched him approach every problem in his life with the particular methodical patience that was both his own and deeply familiar from his father. He practiced in Wichita and later in Kansas City, and wrote letters with the same careful precision he brought to everything. York and Sylvie grew old in Caldwell, in the house with the porch facing west and the lilac bushes that had expanded significantly from the original 2, and the rose bush that had survived 3 harsh winters and produced flowers of a red so dark they were almost purple in the right light. They grew old well, which is not a simple thing and is entirely a matter of what you have built and who you built it with. On a morning in April 1920, Sylvie stood at the kitchen window of the house they had lived in for 37 years and watched York come up the porch steps, back from his morning walk, which he still took every day out of the habit of 30 years, and the simple pleasure of moving through the town. He knew the way he knew his own hands. He was 69 and his hair was white, and he moved a little more slowly than he had in 1882. But the quality of him was intact, the steadiness, the particular way his presence occupied a room. He came in and hung his hat on the peg by the door. The hat was old now, well worn, with the character of a thing that has traveled a great deal and knows the world. It was not the same hat as the one that had started everything, but it was the successor to it, bought the same year she had asked him to replace the old one, and it had been on his head for 38 years. "Good morning," he said, coming into the kitchen. "Good morning," she said. He stood beside her at the window and looked out at the yard, at the lilacs coming into bloom, the April light on everything. "The lilacs are going to be good this year," he said. "They are," she said. She turned and looked at him. This man she had been looking at since a Tuesday afternoon in October 1882, when she had laughed at his hat in the middle of the street, and he had walked across to find out why. This man who had offered to change something he had been holding on to for years, because a woman he did not know had laughed, and it had turned out to matter what she thought. This man who had been honest with her about his past and patient with her fear, and present in every room they had ever occupied together. "York," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," she said, which was not something she said rarely, but which she said with the specific fullness of this particular morning, this particular April, this particular body of time they had accumulated together. He looked at her with the dark eyes that were the same eyes, after all these years, that had met hers across the main street of Caldwell on the day everything started. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the morning I understood what it meant that you laughed at my hat, and I could not stay angry. And I have loved you every day since then. And I am going to love you for every day I have left. And that is the most certain thing I know." She took his face in her hands, the angular face that was lined now with everything that time writes on a face when a life has been fully lived. And she kissed him the way you kiss someone when you have been kissing them for 38 years, and have run out of anything but pure gratitude for the fact of them. Outside, the lilacs were blooming. The April sun was on the Kansas plain. The town of Caldwell was going about its mourning as it had been doing for all the years they had lived in it. And in the kitchen of the house on the north side of town, York and Sylvie Langley stood at the window together and watched the world they had built, which was everything either of them had ever needed, which was everything.